Today we have Jon Carapiet from GE Free New Zealand here to give us an update on what is happening with the gene technology bill. Hi, Jon. How are you today?
Good, thank you. There's a lot been happening in the last few months since we last spoke, so I'm happy to be. Thank you for inviting me to give you an update.
Yeah.
So, do you remember last time the bill, this gene technology bill, had been put into Parliament just before Christmas? We're almost a year away now, and the Select Committee invited, which was the Health Select Committee, invited submissions. 15,000 or so were received, and most of them were very concerned or wanting the bill stopped, or at least wanted major changes to it. And they're still online, and you can go back and watch them. But there's quite a lot of them. Not everyone got to spoke, by the way. They selected people, but they're very illuminating because you see a range of people from a range of expertise and personal views calling on this select committee to really realize that this bill has been structured by industry for industry. It's missed out a whole lot of things that need to be part of any bill that's, before Parliament to regulate gene technology. Forgetting, of course, that they were told they mustn't even consider just amending the current legislation, which is called the Hazardous Substance and New Organisms Act, which some leading scientists in New Zealand are saying that's what you should do. You should amend that because it covers a lot of the things that are now gone missing, and it will be able to enable industry to do the kind of things that it's saying the regulations are stopping. I'd argue that. I think the market, the consumer globally actually has mainly been the slow drag on genetic engineered food anyway. But the select committee heard these things, or rather, sorry, they were in the room or they were online when many of these things were said, but they completely ignored them. It's a real shock, Joe. It's a real shock to see a complete failure of the select committee process, whereby, as I say, a range of different experts and individuals and businesses and industry leaders for like Fonterra and Zespri, but also beef and lamb, the organics industry, health industry, they all said, you've got this bill wrong because you've let the industry write it. You've taken away fundamental things like the choice and labeling of gene edited food, which of course was already happening by the food authorities redefining these organisms and say, oh, well, yes, they are GE, but we're redefining them as not GE, and therefore they're not going to be traced or labeled. Now, food authorities already done that for imported food into New Zealand from America, where else. And this bill was going to do it in the same way, I guess, but at the local level so that products might be grown and not be revealed or told to the consumer because they no longer deemed GMOs or gene edited objects. They're other organisms that are not going to be regulated, very much leaving companies in charge to make sure they are safe, to make sure they are what they think they are. And that's one of the big scientific issues is that gene editing can make unexpected effects. So what the select committee seemed to have done is the report was delayed a couple of times and then they did very little. The advice from the government officials, MB, etc., is really dodgy in my view. I mean, they say, "Oh, look, the submission said this or this submitter said that," but we don't agree. But they give very little and flimsy support to why they don't agree. They're basically dismissing the public. So it's a very shameful whitewash. And they've come out with some changes. Some of them actually are not that bad, but there's a couple of confusions about what happened in that select committee. Number one is they had to work together across all parties and they did agree some changes. So when it says these changes that they recommended in their report are unanimously supported, it's because they could actually find some reasonable ground and say, yeah, if you're going to stick with this bill, you could change it there. And if you're going to stick with this bill, yeah, you could change it there. But there was also all these reports from some of the parties, like the Greens, like Labour, but also like New Zealand First, saying we don't actually agree with some other stuff in this bill. And there was not a unanimous vote to support it being passed. That was a majority vote, and that's by the government parties. So there's New Zealand First, there's National and ACT in the coalition, and they voted for it to move forward to get it out of the select committee back into something, Parliament. The problem is that New Zealand First, and I really want to make a call out to them. And you know, it's a call out with a little bit of a caveat because they haven't delivered it yet. But they did seem to listen to those submissions. They did seem to hear the public concern. They did seem to see what this bill is doing and what's wrong with it. And they've said publicly, and yesterday on the 4th of November, there was a major gathering outside of Parliament to support them and other MPs to say thank you for listening to the public and the experts and the industries and the exporters, all saying, Tai Ho, slow this down, consult, engage, do not do this. They seem to have heard that and are saying they will not support this bill unless there's major changes. And I'm really keen to get into what those changes might be. But what they said, and so some of the MPs, including Winston Peters, came out and talked to the gathering yesterday. It was a picnic outside Parliament. And he said that they're going to fix it. And someone in the audience was saying, or more than one person was saying, "Oh, but what if it can't be fixed?" Because actually, the overall view from many people is that it can't be fixed. It's like so embedded bad that written by industry for industry that to actually get it back onto track for written in the public interest for the national interest is not really that possible. But that's what New Zealand First have committed to do, or they will not support this bill. And I was very pleased. Winston, he's a bit of a fiery old speaker, and he was very clear. He doesn't want absolutism, he said. But when someone said, "Well, what if you can't fix this bill? What will you do?" He said, "Well, we cannot support it then." So that's good news for the public of New Zealand and the future generations and the natural environment. Because the first thing is that this bill won't pass with New Zealand's first support. If they can fix it, which I don't think they can, well, look, let's give them the benefit of the doubt. What I'd like to talk to you, Joe, is about what the fixes need to be. What's wrong with that bill? Not in summary, not that everything that's wrong with the bill, and what New Zealand First needs to be doing to fix it or to replace it with a new bill. And as I said, there's a lot of arguments that the current legislation, the Hazardous Substances and New Organisms Act, could have been fixed up. It could have been done and not created this whole new bill with a whole lot of new problems. Should we talk about that? I mean, should we talk about what kind of things the New Zealand First Party could actually embed into this bill or get written into a bill? Because I think that's where the heart of the matter is. What's in the public and national interest?
If you're going to send a message to New Zealand First, we should make it absolutely clear exactly what specifically you think they might want to take into consideration.
Well, thanks. I mean, I guess first of all, thank you for listening and not betraying the public in that New Zealand, sorry, in that select committee process. I mean, they certainly seem to have listened, and other parties listened, but the other parties aren't in government. This is a government party who've committed to passing some kind of changes to the gene technology laws as long as it protects people and the environment. And that bill does not, this bill does not do that. So what could it look like? And I guess one of the first things is there's a lot of money. This is all about money, ultimately. I mean, you can say it's about many other things, including a battle for humanity, if you want. But money's driving all of these things. And so yesterday at the event, there was people worried about, transhumanism and genetic engineering of people and merging with the machine. And that really is a possibility on the horizon in the not that distant future. It's happening in research levels now. So protection of the non-GMO export advantage, the kind of production that all farmers in New Zealand have today. Basically, there's no commercialized GM production in New Zealand of any crop or animal. There's some nasty animal feed sometimes used, but ultimately we are a GM-free producer. And every brand and every producer and every farmer benefits from that, especially if they're exporting, because that's what the global market is really demanding, non-GMO products. Organic is part of that. But a lot of the debate's been like, oh, it's just the organic people who are benefiting from this, not having GE, and you're just stopping this amazing advancement that we're going to have. And it's like, well, number one is, well, hang on, where's the amazing advancement overseas? Where are these great solutions? A lot of little companies and startups and people growing lab-grown food and things have gone under actually in America. But so apart from the fact doesn't seem to be many successes from the GMOs and gene edited products they've been trying overseas. In New Zealand, the fact that there is none means that everyone benefits from this brand New Zealand reputation. It's very ironic that Fonterra sold their or selling their brands. The farmers voted last week to sell off their consumer brands. I think it's very short-sighted, very foolish. It's their shop window to the world. It was the point of difference to say, look, this is New Zealand. And so in a way, Fonterra have just sold their share in brand New Zealand to someone in France. But brand New Zealand's bigger than any one company or organization. And so brand New Zealand benefits as a GE-free exporter. The markets are growing globally 12, 15%. Fonterra and people like Lewis Road Creamery export to the American market wanting non-GMO food using the non-GMO label because it comes from New Zealand. So there's money in that, billions of value, and that there's been never a economic assessment of this bill. So how any of the parties could actually say, oh, it's okay, let's go and make this major change without economic analysis, I don't know. But anyway, the economic argument is very clear. You've got to protect non-GMO producers. You've got to allow farmers to know what they're planting and it to be GE free and not to be one of the arguments about coexistence, and like, oh, we can have everything. America has everything. America has everything based on contamination of everything. A slowly growing level of contamination of GE ingredients in conventional food. And that's what's happening. So even in Australia, where supposedly we're modeling ourselves on, canola, GE canola has grown. But I mean, just tell the farmers, the non-GE canola gets a premium. They sell it for more. The GM canola's discounted. Same with soybeans globally. There's a demand for non-GMO. There's money in it. So some kind of economic protection is vital in this bill. And just to be clear, the regulator being set up never has to look at the economic pluses and minus, the cost and benefits of any application either. The whole economic, which is really odd if you think about it, it's all about money, but the whole economic analysis has been removed from the bill and removed from the regulator looking at something and whether this is a good idea for New Zealand or not. The second thing that needs to be in the bill, and it relates to the Food Standards Authority decision not to label these gene edited foods, to say, oh, we're not going to consider them, we're redefining them as not GE, so they're not going to be labeled, you're not going to have a choice. Well, number one, it's up to Woolworths, it's up to Foodstuffs, Pack and Save, New World to label these products if they come into the market. Just because Fazans say the consumer doesn't need to know, the public want to know. And when I tell you the public want to know globally, the data is really clear. We're talking about 80, 90% of the public in most countries that I've seen the data for, Europe, America, Germany, want gene edited products disclosed so they can choose and decide. And some good news from America, by the way, is that the Center for Food Safety has been suing the American government over the labeling and this right to know. And they've just won a big win that says, no, the consumers in America, even they have got a right to know. And the rules that have been set up by the US Department of Agriculture don't do that, including things like these ingredients that have always been hidden, even in New Zealand, things like processing aids from precision fermentation, but also highly processed oils from soy, soy or canola. If it's highly processed, they don't get labeled in the supermarket anyway, but because that's the way the rules have been set up. Even that rule has been challenged by in the courts and said, yeah, this is not good. You're not allowing the consumer the right to choose in America, and they need to. And I guess the same thing is, to the point is, this bill needs to say you're going to have a choice. So not only protect GE-free production, non-GMO producers and farmers, but allow consumers and farmers to know if it is a GE thing, that they can choose or not to buy it or not. And that means labeling, and that's what's been taken away by this bill and the Food Authority decision. And that needs to be addressed in this bill or a new bill. And interestingly, Winston Peters, in his talk yesterday to this gathering outside of Parliament, there to support people like him and the parties saying, no, you can't go ahead with this gene technology bill. He said that he supported the right to choose, and that means labeling. And just to be clear, that labeling is being denied by the food authorities. It's been taken away by this bill because this bill excludes regulation of a whole lot of things new organisms, gene edited organisms. I mean, this is the fundamental issue. It removes regulation. It deregulates a whole lot of gene edited plants, animals, bacteria, viruses, fungi. Nobody watching it, nobody monitoring it. Now, the select committee did say, oh, maybe they should register these things. Maybe someone could actually make a list of these new uncontrolled products that are coming into reality potentially. But that's not good enough. So having labeling and having that commitment from New Zealand First to say, no, you're going to have a right to choose is quite important. He may not have meant, well, of all those gene edited products that are going to be hidden, but I can't see what else he could have meant. What else could he mean? If we're talking about the removal of regulation of gene edited food, the denial of public choice, he says, oh no, the public should choose, then that's a very good commitment from New Zealand First. What wasn't so clear, certainly in his speech yesterday, but is very clear from what was presented to the select committee in evidence but not picked up on them, is the need for precaution. I mean, Joe, you know that old thing about the doctors used to have the Hippocratic Oath to do no harm. So, like, basically, you're trying to do your thing, but if you think you might actually kill your patient, you don't do it. Now, there's a similar thing. This is how I think of it, called the precautionary principle, which says if the technology, and this is what the regulator, this gene technology regulator, should be required to think about, but has been told not to think about this. That's the point. The regulator, he or she, will not have to consider the precautionary principle. Now, I would think they have to consider the precautionary principle, and other people need to be considering the precautionary principle. It needs to be stated explicitly in the bill because it's like that backstop, it's the guardrail for regulation. If he's about to or she's about to approve some technology or gene edited innovation or medicine, some of which might be automatically coming in from overseas. Oh, you've got to approve it. It's been approved in two other countries. The regulator needs to have some local decision-making power that says, no, I think this could be really damaging to people or nature, and apply the precautionary principle. So that seems to be something that needs to be in the bill. And so maybe New Zealand First can fix that up. The other thing that's not in the bill is anything to do with ethics and values. And I know that that's not, compared with money and exports, that's wishy-washy, but they haven't been looking at the money side either. They're about to throw our export industry under the bus if contamination spreads. They haven't done a financial or economic analysis. There's no built-in protection of the GM-free advantage. But on the other side, there's no ethics either. There's no values. There's no requirement to not be cruel to animals with extreme experimentation that's already happened in New Zealand. Over 20 years, there's a report from GE3 New Zealand written by Claire Bleakley, who looked at all the ag research reports on these animal trials of pigs, I see cows, sheep, a number of other animals over the years, goats. And some very unfortunate outcomes have happened in those experiments, very nasty, cruel outcomes for the animals, but also not a lot of success technologically. Now those experiments seem to have come to a halt, but there's nothing in this bill to not allow it to restart and to do some very nasty things with gene edited to animals. And then let's leave the animals aside because I've said that bit. What about the people? A lot of people are concerned, and again, it was some wording in the original bill's wording that the select committee report says, oh, change this wording because people are getting confused, they say, and people are worried about mandatory use of gene technology, including in medicine. So what the original bill said was there was a mandatory emergency medical approval of a gene technology product if it had been approved in two other countries overseas by the regulator. In other words, to kind of fast track something, I guess, in an emergency global pandemic kind of scenario, but not necessarily. I mean, it was about emergency approvals, but there was also other things in this bill that make me think, and certainly my interpretation was, no, they're opening it up to say other products, not necessarily an emergency, that have been approved by, respected overseas. Who they are will be published, by the way, but they haven't said who they are yet. But respected and approved overseas authority will rubber stamp it. It will come through automatically in New Zealand because those guys have approved it. Now, again, this loss of sovereignty, this loss of control is really sabotage to New Zealand because, what's being approved overseas might very well be at a disadvantage for us. It takes away a competitive edge like our GE free export advantage. So those issues are very much in reality that whether the medical uses could be enforced on people. So there's some statements in the report from the select committee saying, "Oh no, that's not what we meant." Reassure people, but I'm not sure we can be reassured, and I'll tell you why. Because they're saying, "Oh, don't worry, we wouldn't do something like that. We don't mean mandatory use of these products. They'd still have to be approved by MedSafe and all these other groups." I've seen something very awful in the last year, and that's the total betrayal of the public process by that select committee. I don't think anyone can have confidence in any of those people on that select committee who allowed from the governing parties who've allowed this bill to now be potentially having a second reading any minute. Thank thank goodness that New Zealand First has kind of said no at this point. So there were fears that it would go into a select committee, sorry, second reading tomorrow. Here it is, rubber stamp it, off we go, because they ignored thousands of submitters. They ignored them. And that's really fundamentally dangerous for democracy, for good governance, for finding a kind of navigating of middle path for New Zealand around gene editing and gene technologies. You know, it's never going to be banned. There is medicine being imported. There are things. I can't see a time when there's going to be a total ban on GE ever again. But what we have to have is defend what we've got, which is GE-free exports, and have these guardrails, these principles in place that are not in this bill. So the fear, and who did that? The select committee did, because they were begged actually by people to say, look, stop this. Please listen to us. Please expand the discussion. Please make sure there is some other things in this bill which they didn't add. There's also the issue of what they did do, which was take the advice of the experts who are already dominated by industry just to tinker around the edge. So that failure makes me worry that there's no ethics in this bill, because I don't think ethics are anywhere in their mind, and certainly not in their behaviors in that select committee over this last year. And there's a bigger issue about, as I mentioned right at the beginning, the whole eugenics. Some people may not know what that is, but eugenics is a really interesting thing. It's a movement that crosses from America to Britain to Nazi Germany and echoes in the world today, currently, with technology surrounding it, which says we can make better humans, and that human over there ain't good enough, and that human there is the ideal, and we're going to make them. And those people who are not ideal aren't going to be around too much. In fact, we might even get rid of them. Now, that is the scenario that happened in the 1940s in Germany. But it happened earlier by getting rid of mentally ill people and disabled people in Britain and America. So it's a global phenomenon. And eugenics is kind of back because gene editing might be able to improve human beings, say some people. Well, I think we really must have some ethical boundaries to stop that, to stop the enforced use of medical interventions, to stop the enforced changing of humanity. And we did have a bioethics council set up after the Royal Commission 20 years ago. It said, oh yeah, ethics are big in this. Oh yeah, gene editing and genetic engineering. Yeah, there's some ethical issues here. Let's have a council. Then the council was abolished. Again, for convenience sake, who in industry really wants to think about values and ethics? Well, I'm afraid you have to. And certainly in the food industry, people like Woolworths, people like foodstuffs, people like, Fonterra and Zespri, they need to think about ethics because there's an ethical relationship with their customers, not to deceive them, not to sell them stuff they don't want, not to hide it. But ethics obviously is that much bigger thing. And so I think there needs to be, New Zealand First needs to say, yeah, we need some ethical parameters in this bill. The last couple of things go to control. It goes back to, I mean, control is one of the things that I believe, and you could call it sovereignty, but it goes back to what I was saying a little bit earlier, which was that, by having built into this bill, oh, if this overseas organization or two of them approve this thing, you get it. And it kind of gets fast tracked. Totally disastrous loss of sovereignty, really handing over power to people who are already highly influencing those markets and those regulators overseas from industry. So we've got to have decision making in the public interest in New Zealand. We can't allow that loss of sovereignty overseas. To add to all the other loss of sovereignties through trade deals and all that, this is just icing on the cake. I mean, in fact, it's part of the web of things that are not in the public interest because it's more in the and it goes to things like Acts Regulatory Standards Bill. I mean, this bill would not pass that Regulatory Standards Bill, except on the virtue of it transfers all the risk to the public. And kind of like compensate, it doesn't just compensate industry, it subsidizes them by socialized risk. So control in New Zealand's really important. But the last kind of like major change that has to be done to this bill is liability on, that kind of polluter pays kind of thing, liability on users of gene technology. Because, Joe, at the moment, it's what's called socialized risk. So if an authority rubber stamps something or approves it and something goes wrong, in the realm of gene technology, oh, what a shame. People have died. A farm and land has been permanently contaminated or temporarily contaminated, hopefully. What a shame. The public will have to clean this up. And it's happened before. Now, regional councils like Northland, and there was a protest, actually, it was a protest outside of Shane Vetti's office in Whangarei yesterday to coincide with the gathering outside of Parliament to say thank you to the MPs for stopping this bill. But that protest was in a particular interest because up there in Northland and in other places like Hastings and even Auckland, councils put in some precautions in their plans. They said, oh, look at the risk exposure of ratepayers to cost for cleanup. If a company does a gene experiment and then something goes wrong and it goes bankrupt, the public have to pay to clean it up because that's what happened before with these 2,000 sheep from a company called PPL, and they went bankrupt. They were run in New Zealand. I mean, like people say, oh, we're being stopped from doing these experiments. Well, no, they've had them, mate, and they've been doing them behind closed doors or in open fields. And the PPL sheep were destroyed because the product failed to work. The company went bankrupt. They had to destroy all the animals. Jim Bolger, the late Jim Bolger, who spoke out at the time and said, look, why is the public having to pay for this? Where's the insurance cover for these companies? And I would say that liability and liability insurance is probably the most important pillar, final pillar to put into any legislation because ACT have remained silent on ratepayer exposure to costs and socializing risk. Now, I know that they're mainly big business, really, but they've got to have some pride in their name. And the fact that consumers are not going to have any choice and ratepayers are exposed to costs, I would have thought they'd be onto that and say, yeah, let's rebalance that and make sure that the user, so the polluter pays. Well, the most interesting thing in one of the most interesting things in that disastrous report from the Select Committee that's basically following their handlers' guidance and not listening to the public was it's really interesting, Joe. I mean, and you're the only person who I've actually shared this with publicly. It's there. The Select Committee say you got to get some insurance for the regulator because the insurance and the liability of the regulator to doing something terribly bad and dangerous for New Zealand makes, if they're exposed to liability and being sued for destroying New Zealand, for example, destroying our environment by or killing thousands of people by approving something that they didn't think was going to do something bad, but it did. The job's not very appealing, they say. The job of the regulator, if they're liable for something going terribly wrong, without precaution and without ethics, if something goes terribly wrong, they need to get some insurance and to have some insurance cover, indemnity of the regulator. Now that's a very interesting question. And again, the media haven't picked up on this. No one has said, hang on, what kind of things will he have to be, he or she, the regulator, need to be insured for? What kind of premiums would be able to cover those risks? And how would they be funded? Now, in theory, you could say, well, they'll be funded by a tax or, a levy on the biotechnology industry to cover the risks of its industry via the regulator. So maybe that's an option. But liability has to be part of this bill, and it's not. And I tell you, it's not just me and people all over the world who thinks polluters should pay and not enforce those costs. And it's not just the councils who have, sorry, to be clear, that right of councils to apply precaution and protect their ratepayers is being taken away by this bill. So it has to be applied nationally. If they can't do it locally, it has to be national. And I hope New Zealand first realise that, the precautionary principle nationally. But those councils could and have required a bond, excuse the pun, from the company to say, right, if you're going to do this experiment, you've got to notify us, you've got to put a bond down to maintain its controls, and you've got to put a bond down to clean it up afterwards. That kind of control and precaution in their public interest. Now, the one person who, again, you'd think the select committee would heed this person or this organization, this body. It was the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, Simon Upton. And his presentation to the select committee totally ignored, as far as I can tell, because one of the key things he recommended was civil liability. He described this bill as transferring risk from the industry that's pushing for this deregulation to get its way onto the public, onto nature, onto the wider community. And in his submission, he says, "Oh, you should introduce civil liability on these companies to encourage them to comply with precaution and to try and not pollute other farms and to not harm people with their products." And that's not in the bill either. So that was the final thing. And let's open for any more discussion and questions you might have. But that would be the final thing, New Zealand First. And all parties, I mean, to be honest, Joe, it's not New Zealand First that should just be doing this. National MPs and ACT MPs, if those things we've gone through are not in the bill, if it comes back to Parliament, they should cross the floor. They should listen to their hearts, to their consumers, sorry, their citizens, their voters, their communities, their export markets. They should listen to the landscape that surrounds us and say, look, this bill cannot pass, and it would be immoral not to cross the floor if protection, choice, precaution, ethics, local control, and liability on those who are threatening us are not in place.
Absolutely. One thing I am wondering is, do they give any justification as to why they don't want GMOs specifically labeled?
Yes, because the official view from experts in industry and the food authorities is that they believe that all these gene edited products that are not going to be regulated are safe. And that's because some gene edited products could have happened in nature. Now, the big scientific argument, and I'd really encourage people to look into the commentary from the University of Canterbury, Professor Jack Heinemann, because he's trying to explain. In fact, he wrote an op-ed in the Post newspaper on Monday, I think it was, which would have been the 2nd, I think, 3rd of November. He wrote a piece saying even the regulators and the food authorities are confused because they're saying, oh, so if it could have happened in nature, it must be safe. Number one, first confusion, bad things happen in nature too. So poisonous things can happen in nature too. There was actually an instance where a mutagenesis product, so it wasn't a genetically engineered product or genetically modified product, but it was using another form of scrambling genes, and it was a swede, a kind of swede that was used as animal feed. You can look it up. The main coverage online actually is so this was a swede that was given to cows somewhere in the South Island. About 200 or 300 animals died, and they went, "Oh, why are these animals dead?" And they did an investigation, and it turns out there was some kind of toxicity created in this swede from mutagenesis. But the main coverage you'll find if you Google this, swede, I think toxic swedes killed cattle, you'll find people, journalists, talking about the cover up of what happened with these animals in these swedes because it's not a good look. So that's way back that mutagenesis and these things that are saying are safe and why the argument is you've accepted mutagenesis public. There's some plants out there that we've done to before. So why don't you want these? And what's more, many of these things that we're doing or about to do, they haven't even been done yet. It's all on a promise. The product could have happened in nature over thousands of years. It might have happened. So what's the difference between us doing it in a lab and thousands of years of evolution? Well, quite a lot, like an enormous amount. And the fact that these techniques do not just change one gene in an organism very precisely, but they can cause other effects. They change all the genes. I mean, Professor Heinemann's very good. He talks about, no, this is incredibly efficient. It doesn't just change one gene, it changes all the copies of that gene in every organism that that gene altering product touches, and it will change those sequences if they appear in any other organism that it touches. So the idea of spraying gene editors onto fields to kill an insect, it's very likely that that sequence targeting that insect will also appear in other insects like butterflies or bees or whatever. And that precision will have then, that's what he calls effectiveness. It's efficient, that's the word. The efficiency of gene editing means that it will carry on gene editing other organisms as well in the field, potentially. So that's to answer your question, they're arguing, well, you don't need to know because they kind of could have been natural. And the answer is they aren't natural. And as I said earlier, consumers know that. When you do the research with consumers, and in GE research and genetic engineering and GMOs, it's very confusing for everybody, including Parliament. But when you ask and explain to people, this is a GMO, this is a gene edited product, which has not had anything new introduced to it in theory anyway, and this is traditional, they very clearly say, oh, yeah, gene editing and genetic engineering and GMOs are the same kind of stuff. And traditional breeding is this other thing that we quite like. Some people don't mind the other stuff, but everyone agrees they should have the right to choose. And that's been taken away. So I guess to answer your question, it's a sellout to industry. That's why they don't want to label GMOs and gene edited products. It makes it so much easier to sell them because people have no choice.
I see that Watties is not going to make their peaches anymore because there weren't enough sales. They're being undercut by PAMs.
From
And I'm
China
worried
and
about
places.
other food from the Hawke's Bay after the natural disaster. This is another worry for me. A GMO area supplying food, no longer producing as much food. Maybe even the vegetables might be in danger because they can't do it as cheaply as PAMs.
Pam's is the biggest brand in New Zealand, as they'll tell us in their advertising, and it's a New Zealand brand in theory, at least. And it's mainly a lot of things are made in New Zealand, but a lot of things are made overseas, like any major brand. Except that I believe that foodstuffs, they're locally owned. They're part of our communities all over New Zealand. I would love to see Pam stand up against this gene edited, unregulated, unlabeled process. And okay, I know it's a dream, but I'd love to see them replace Rotties and say, all right, we'll buy your peaches. I know it's all about price when it comes to food for many people, but it's usually many people who really have been put into a hard position financially. I used to argue with my mum actually, like sometimes cheap food ain't a good deal. And you have to look at what you're getting because there's a reason why it's cheap. And there's a lot of highly processed food. In fact, one of the arguments for lab-raised meat is that it's going to be cheaper and more sustainable and not hurt the animals and all this sort of thing. But it's also highly processed. May also impact our gut bacteria. It's waste products going out into streams or whatever could actually contaminate the environment. So the promise of gene editing or genetically modified food or lab-grown food that might be cheap and better for the environment is not a reality at this stage. It's quite the opposite at this stage. But in terms of what is a big, I think they're owned by Kraft. They've sold out the New Zealand ownership well before Fonterra sold out or are selling us out. It's a very short look, it's the reality of big marketing and global brands. But my problem as an advocate for brand New Zealand is it undersells New Zealand. So Pam should be trying to make everything it can in New Zealand and export that to the world and as Pams. They won't, but they could. They should. They really could. I spoke to Watties 20 years ago and said there's a demand for New Zealand products. You could be exporting your Waddies, blah, blah, soup from New Zealand to other parts of the world. They were starting to go into those, like, those little sachet bags and of soups on the supermarket shelf. As a marketer and as a brand consultant of many years and a market researcher, I should say, I've really dealt with these large brands, and I'm very frustrated that Fonterra failed to make an argument to say, look, okay, our brands like Mainland are only, I think it was like they're only 8 or 10% of our sales. Well, make it 20. In most companies, you'd say, right, we want that up, mate. The boardroom would say, we want that increase. We want more sales of our products as branded. Don't start giving it to the supermarket own labels. Hire some new marketers, do some new campaigns, invest internationally. So Fonterra haven't done that. And it's a real shame because they are going to lose that asset of brand New Zealand. I don't know how you feel, but I went and bought some cheese the other day and I was suddenly looking at mainland going, oh, I buy you normally. And there's the supermarket one that says it's mature cheddar and so a couple of dollars cheaper. And I'm thinking, oh, I don't feel the same about you anymore. And that was just me, God knows how many other New Zealanders are going to say, I don't feel the same about your mainland cheese anymore. They might do now, they might do in a few months' time. They know the farmers. But the farmers have been, I really feel sorry for the Fonterra farmers. They are convinced to sell their own grandmother. They've been convinced to sell their the one point of difference, their one connection to the consumer globally. And I guess Hawke's Bay, to be honest, I have no worry. I don't share the worry that you have. I mean, it's terrible if big disasters like storms and things come through anywhere. But I think that Hastings and Hawke's Bay and New Zealand food is on the up. That's why this gene technology bill is actually economic sabotage because we've kind of got what the world wants in terms of, and we can make it better. I mean, we're not 100% pure. We all know that. We're not clean and green as much as we could be. But the strategic argument that's not happening is, shouldn't we become that? And make it more sustainable and more ethical and do the things that the market says it will pay extra for and is paying for our products now. Do more of that, guys. I mean, this is basic, marketing 101. People want that, do more of that. People don't want that, do less of that. And that's the jack up. That's why they don't want to make label GMOs. The reason why there's no big market for GMOs in New Zealand is because the consumers don't want it. And if they have to label it, they can't sell it. So they put it into food service industry where they don't have to label it in cafes. It goes into animal feed in America. Animals can't complain. It goes into making ethanol in America to make petrol and stuff. It's like because in the food use, there's a lot of push against it. And I'll just finish off with one observation. There's people going around saying scientists from the University of Auckland and the head of the life sciences industry say, oh, we could be growing GM soy in New Zealand to make impossible burgers and supply them instead of them importing it. I mean, this is all absolute nonsense. And not least because the Impossible Burger stopped using GM soy as the main ingredient in export markets like New Zealand and others, where people didn't want GM soy. They still use this genetically engineered heme, this bloody kind of effect. And and I think we might have talked about this before, I can totally understand why I actually think good on Impossible Burger. Not that I would buy it or eat it. I don't want it. But they could see where the market converged. People did not want to support industrial sprayed with glyphosate. And there's some good news about glyphosate we should touch on actually. And no, heavily sprayed with glyphosate, damaging the Amazon forest or whatever it's doing, industrial soy. They don't want that, but they don't want to. They like the idea of creating this artificial blood that will stop people who would love blood and bloody meat eating that meat, they'll eat this. Now that doesn't actually work, so it's a bit of a nonsense anyway. But if you believe it, you don't want to support the GE soy destroying the world, but and sprayed with Roundup, but you do want less animal husbandry. That's the product for you, the Impossible Burger now, because they've stopped using the GE soy. So for the scientists to say we could grow GE soy in New Zealand and make Impossible Burger, they're out of touch. They're behind the times. The Impossible Burgers doesn't use GE soy. They want non-GMO soy from New Zealand if we were growing it. I mean, so it turns out, and you can look this up again online, it turns out the Impossible Burger importers test every batch that they import to make sure it's non-GMO soy.
That's great. So I do want to get onto glyphosate as well.
Yeah, let's
I just
talk
want you
about
to
that.
briefly touch on GMOs and medication, gene technology bill and medication. Do you have any concerns in that area off the top of your head?
In terms of medication of the glyphosate.
Well, in terms of developing medication using gene technology, do you have any concerns around
Oh,
that?
look, it's an absolute gold rush and it's going to happen and they're going to go ahead.
Yeah.
Which takes me back to the conversation we had about ethics, the conversation about human rights, about not enforcing medical experimentation or use on people in the public or animals, actually. So the background and there's experts in this that I'm a marketer, I'm a brand person, I'm a consumer advocate. I'm not a doctor, I'm not an expert, but I know people who are. and I know that there's a lot of concerns from, and I know, and I think I get why. This idea of the RNA platform. I mean, this is not, no, not to relitigate what's gone on with the an escape, what seems to have been an escape of a gain of function research project into the world and causing all the havoc we saw. So that was a gene editing or genetic engineering biotech project that went wrong, it seems. And then the rush to get the vaccine out, and all the skullduggery around ignoring other solutions and other options and other treatments and other anything because it had to get emergency approval with those options not existing. So that skullduggery and the hijacking of good process of doctors and academics in the medical field, we've seen that. So again, it goes back to why I can't be very happy with the select committee on this gene technology bill saying, oh, ethics can be managed somewhere else. Well, you didn't even manage it in your own select committee. And the history of the COVID experience shows that values and good science and informed choice was hijacked. Now the money idea of that went so well, say some of the proponents of the RNA platform, that we should have all the existing vaccines, which I think, seem to have been successful in many ways, may have not in others. But anyway, I don't think if there are any problems with the history of vaccines in New Zealand or the world, changing them all to an RMNA platform will not solve those problems. The problem that I understand from, and again, I would encourage you to talk to someone like Dr. Guy Hatchard or Dr. Heinemann or some of the global experts. But my understanding in a kind of layman's term is how do you switch it off? So what I've seen about spike protein production, for example, from the COVID vaccines was that it doesn't just happen in the arm, it happened around the body, and for some it happened around the heart, and in women it happened around the ovaries, or at least things seems to have gathered there, some of the lipoparticles. So it's a complex thing that I don't know a lot about. But I think we should be very worried if the lessons that were should have been learned from what we've been through with say the COVID thing are not learned but hijacked in a similar way to this bill, not learning the lessons of 20 or 30 years experience in America and hijacking it to be the dream of the biotechnology industry and ignoring the public, nature, animals, future generations, exports, producers, farmers. That's the problem.
Yeah. So, what are your concerns around glyphosate?
Well, look, it's a global thing. So just in case people don't know, because I think some people don't know, there's two main kinds of GMO crops, GE crops in America and around the world that have been marketed. I think it's about 80% of the current growing GE crops are either glyphosate resistant, so they can be sprayed with Roundup, or actually or other chemicals, or they produce a kind of natural insecticide called BT that kills insects. Those are the main uses. Now, look, I can hear the scientists saying, "Oh, that was the past. In the future, we have all these other uses, and that may be, but it needs to be regulated. It needs to have those guardrails in place that we discussed earlier, and which are not in place." But glyphosate is a registered antibiotic. It disrupts the gut biome. It kills beneficial insects in the field. Very, very, I can't see how they can't be called stupid farmers and stupid people, both in New Zealand and around the world, have been authorized and therefore have used it to dry out crops just before harvesting. So a crop gets an extra dose of glyphosate to dry it out to make it easy to harvest. That has to stop. And I believe a recent decision in New Zealand, and haven't been into depth in this, but there is the Stop Glyphosate campaign online, and good work being done. And they seem to have had some success with, along with Greenpeace and other groups saying, hang on, stop this, because there was a proposal to significantly increase the residues of glyphosate in peas and oats and some other crops in New Zealand. And it seems that in most cases, they are not to be increased. And it seems that the use of glyphosate as a desiccant at the end of, just before harvesting is supposed to stop. Now, again, I'm not an expert on it, but those are both very good things, not to increase the exposure of glyphosate. In America, glyphosate's all over the place. It's in the waterways, it's in the tap water, it's in people's bodies. And it does seem to impact, as I say, gut biome. It's an antibiotic, so it will kill things. It's the most commonly used of them all. And of course, some crops or sort of other weeds have become resistant to glyphosate. So there's this terrible thing going on in America where you've got a crop, genetically engineered crop, that's been genetically engineered to survive being sprayed by Roundup. Therefore, it absorbs the Roundup and it goes into our food. But sometimes the weeds have become resistant. So now they're putting in, oh, it can be sprayed with dicamba, another chemical, and it won't die. But the dicamba goes in. And if that doesn't work, guess what? We've stacked it so that you can actually use a third chemical on this crop and it won't die and it will absorb it, but you get your crop. So this stacking of resistance, and actually, I mean, it does link to gene editing because the argument about gene editing makes something that could have happened in nature. Well, only if you make sure that's exactly what you've done. And the deregulation, the exclusionary regulation of gene edited organisms, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, means that you're able to, just as you can stack gene sequences and traits in these crops, GMOs, you can progressively change an organism with gene editing and make one change that, yeah, it could have happened in nature over 1,000 years. Let's make another change. Oh, yeah, that could have happened in nature over 1,000 years. Let's make another change. And that could have happened. But cumulatively, you've created an organism that has nothing to do with a kind of embedded ecological evolutionary system. It's imposed by technology and experts into it. So again, containing those organisms and not having them outside the lab is quite important. And recognizing that gene edited organisms are not natural. They are not like traditional breeding. They come with new risks. To assume they have no new risks, to assume that the companies will regulate themselves, is to assume the wrong thing.
Thank you. Where are you going from here with regards to the gene technology bill? What do you see yourself doing next, your campaign?
Well, there's a little card that's addressed to all MPs. I am very grateful to New Zealand First for standing up. I think it's the best thing that any MPs or parliamentary party could actually possibly do. And of course, other parties have stood up against this bill, but they're not in power. They're not in government. So I would look to National Enact to stop this bill too, to recognise that they've made a good effort to listen to their backers, whoever's pushing it from the biotechnology industry, including academia. There's a lot of people in universities say, oh yeah, deregulate, allow this, but they've got investments, they've got money and patents behind it. You've got to have the structures that we talked about earlier in place to moderate, to navigate a middle path for New Zealand. So the bill should not come back to Parliament. If it does come back to Parliament without protection of GE free, protection of the consumer right to choose. And this, as I say, in America, this recent decision to say no, people have the right to know. It's called the Right to Know campaign. We need an equivalent here and not have that taken away. We need the precautionary principle embedded in legislation. We need ethics to be part of the process, to not be cruel to animals, to not be exploitative of human beings, to not allow eugenics into our future, to have that local control and decision making and to hold users liable. If those things are not in a bill that comes back to Parliament, then it cannot pass. If New Zealand First pass that bill without those things, then we're in danger territory. We're and I don't think they can. I don't think they would. I don't even want to imagine what the implications would be of perhaps a really heavy-handed pressure on New Zealand First from America, from someone powerful, Monsanto or Bayer, saying, look, you guys stop this, you get into line, you back this bill. If they try and fix it with half fixes, that's equally bad. They need to stop this bill. They need to have a roundtable national conversation that allows these pillars to be built into some legislation. The protests and the efforts need to continue. Therefore, I would ask people to write to any MP in the National Act or New Zealand First Party and say, you've got to stop this bill. You've got to have these basic principles in place to protect New Zealand's future. National Enact would probably laugh at you and say, oh no, there's money in this and you don't know anything about it. Well, the independent scientists are warning us and New Zealand First are listening. I tell you, look, I'm not being funny. If New Zealand First stay true to these values that I've outlined here and fight for these in this bill or stop this bill, I would estimate that they will have between 15 and 20% of the vote at the next election, possibly even more, if they can explain what they've done, if they can explain to the public that they are stopping the sellout of New Zealand to big business and the biotechnology industry, a bill written by them for them, at the expense of everybody else and the things we've already got, like our GE-free export advantage and a natural environment that could be cleaner, could be greener. And not to dismiss all these scientists who are working and funded to do gene edited experiments, etc. We've got to find a middle path. But for me, that middle path has to be maintaining that GE-free environment and using these things ethically in the lab. You know, I'm very concerned about this push for lab grown meat and for like precision fermentation from artificial milk. And the reason why I'm concerned is one is because they seem to be suggesting that there's no downside to this, that it's all going to be all upside, no animals, no this, no that. But the inputs can be contaminated. You know, the whole argument that gene editing has no transgenes in, the actual very materials and processes can be contaminated by these other genes, as happened with the Horner's cow in America, where it was gene edited and they found antibiotic genes had popped into it and other genes had popped into it. And I think that the lab grown meat that was sold in New York for a short time in a flash restaurant has been pulled because they found contaminating foreign genes in their input supply, and maintaining purity of a vat fermentation for food is you're basically making a pharmaceutical. You need that standard, and that's where the cost doesn't work. If you have to have these high standards for safety, you can't make it cheap. And so the questions around fake food and real food and climate change and solutions to these issues that we're all facing and debating, I believe that we've really, as I say, got to recognize that we've got solutions already. Just because they have no patent on them does not mean they're not a good idea. Like mixed forage for cows. I'd love to see more New Zealand farmers using mixed forage. Don't go down the Bovier. I don't know whether you've heard of this, but there's bloody bolus that's killing some animals, it seems, by reports from farmers overseas. Don't need the GE ryegrass. There's already conventionally bred ryegrasses that will do this, and I say mixed forage actually reduces methane. So if that's what you want to do and maintain good animal health and production, do that. You don't need to spend millions and wait 20 years for a product that's only actually been eaten by, I think, 12 lambs in a lab earlier this year. These products for the G ryegrasses and things, they seem to have been gone on. They're not the ones that have gone overseas because they couldn't do them here, went to Australia. There's not been enough product to actually do an animal feeding trial until this year, and they couldn't find enough of that. So they grew it, I think, in pots and in greenhouses, and they gave it to lambs for about 3 weeks to see whether it reduced the methane. And I don't think it was, it didn't reduce it much more than anything else might have done. So, I mean, we've got to recognize that there's vested interests on all sides, but particularly from the biotechnology industry, and for a middle path that maintains the integrity of our food supply and the values of New Zealand into the future, we need this legislation stopped. So yeah, I mean that's so to answer your question, what's next is stop the gene technology bill, and that shouldn't just be left to New Zealand First. That should be all MPs in those governing parties. And of course, if they don't, then thanks New Zealand First for doing the right thing.
Thank you. That's been great. Thank you for coming on the Kiwi Rocket. I wish you the very best with your campaign. I hope you
Thank you,
come back.
Joe. And it's everyone's campaign. Let's remember when, as I said, market research in this sector is very difficult. But the last really good study that showed how difficult and confused people were was by a group called Primary Purpose, who did it off their own back, I think. And they work with obviously the primary industry. And the people who actually support this radical change that the government's proposing is 14%, 14%. The majority of people want case by case assessment, which is going with these exclusions of gene editing. They want, a lot of people want, for the opportunities to be available, but, careful, step by step ethics. That's what we've got and has been taken away. So the majority of people support what we've got now, or even stricter G free policy for New Zealand. That's not what this bill's offering.
That's great. Thank you so much for coming on the
Thank you
Kiwi.
very much. And please, everyone get hold get hold of your MP. Also, there will be some more, vigils probably at supermarkets to say, come on, Woolworths, come on, Pam's, come on, New World. Please label if these products come in imported or they've grown, if God forbid, in New Zealand, label them, disclose them, allow your consumers choice. And certainly, like keep like macro. I buy a lot of macro from Woolworths and it's like organic and natural. Don't allow gene editing into these products. Don't allow it into Woolworths' own. Don't allow it into Pam's. Maybe a bit too late. I mean, apparently Pam's do allow genetically modified feed in some of their products like cheese and eggs. And again, that's not a good thing to be doing. But that's the start of the worst. Let's push it back and maintain what the integrity of our food supply. So yeah, I think this, if the government won't listen, the supermarkets have to listen. And so that's maybe where things go next.
Fantastic. Do keep me posted on those vigils. I will advertise them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And get people along. It's just it's such an interesting time because I mean, ironically, Joe, I still people meet people who say, "I've never even heard of this bill," and you think, "Oh, I've handed out all those cards and I've been on all these interviews saying, come on, everybody," and other people have, of course, as well. But so I'll actually make sure that people keep informed, and so thank you for doing this because there's a lot of things coming at people, and to keep this in mind, especially as the media haven't covered it. Radio New Zealand did cover Winston Peters' speech to the gathering at Parliament yesterday on the 4th of November. I would encourage people to look it up. It quotes me as saying that the select committee process was a sham, which it was, and it also quotes Winston Peters saying he will not allow this bill to pass if it's not fixed up. And now, thank you for allowing me to tell people what does fixed up look like.
Well, thank you for running this campaign. I mean, you've provided a lot of relevant information, and I think that it's basically life and death in some ways. People eating poison is going to make people sick, maybe kill people ultimately.
And
So,
from an industry point of view, well, it's not poisonous, but from a human point of view, well,
yeah,
can't I have the choice to make sure?
yeah.
Thanks so
Nice to
much.
see you.
Take care.
You
Ka
too.
kite.